Maltese Falcon is that is the book. Now he ended up, Warner Brothers ended up doing, and we talked about this morning. They did the one in 1931, and then they did the kind of send up on it. Satan Was a Lady with Betty Davis, which she hated, and then of course there's the one we all know and love that John Huston made with Bogart and Sidney Greenstreet. But what was your grandfather's involvement with the studio as his work became renowned, and then they optioned it for the movies and got the rights from him?
Right. So Warner Brothers got the rights basically from Random House because they sold the movie rights along with the books in those days. So we had no control and they had no income off the sale of those. It's strictly
nice.
all of that. We had all three movies. You got no income off the movie rights themselves. Yeah, I know, they changed that, didn't they?
Yeah, good.
So they came out with the first movie in 1931. They were finished filming, I think, 13, 14 months after the book was published, so pretty quick turnaround. Ricardo Cortez plays the Sam Spade character. He gets it all wrong. I mean,
that was not good casting.
No, and the movie itself, I mean, the script, it isn't spectacular, but it's a fairly straightforward adaptation. Kind of interesting because it's pre-Hays Code, so it's got some little sexier stuff in it that wouldn't have passed. But the Spade character is slimy and oily and really greedy and everything that careless readers or people who only know like Sam Spade's name think that Sam Spade is. So Darryl Zanuck apparently was satisfied with this, and it was a moderate success. It wasn't earth-shattering, but it was fairly successful. So Zanuck then hires my grandfather to write a sequel to that. Now my grandfather, having hated this Sam Spade, of course writes what Darryl Zanuck asks for. He writes this story with a Spade-like character who's slimy and grasping and underhanded. So his name is Gene Richmond. I don't know why they could. So they changed the name, which the whole thing is rather confusing. So they paid my grandfather $5,000 for the first draft, $5,000 for the second draft. There was supposed to be a third payment. Darryl Zanuck at that point put his foot down and said, "No, this has none of the qualities of the Maltese Falcon." Well, that's because you wanted, a sequel to the movie.
Right.
So he ended up giving back the rights to my grandfather, and didn't make the third payment. My grandfather retained the rights to that screen story, which he eventually rewrote and sold to Universal. It became Mr. Dynamite in 1935.
Right.
So. The other thing's interesting about this case is when, you remember the CBS versus Hammett, when CBS and the radio shows, CBS Radio versus Warner Brothers, because Warner Brothers was claiming that they owned the character rights. They owned the character rights when they bought, and this was a big problem, right? And so this went to court, and the question was, if you sell story, then are you
selling the characters?
Are you selling the characters
in perpetuity, so they can do remakes and all that other stuff?
And at that point, Warner Brothers was claiming, though even this had not been explicitly addressed in the contract, that they owned them. And my grandfather and CBS Radio were saying no, and it went to court. And this Darryl Zanuck thing was part of the testimony. And the fact that they had paid my grandfather to do the rewrite reinforced his case, and they eventually won, which is good for writers everywhere, and that case law still stands.
What did your grandfather think of the 1941 version with that we all know and love? Was he happy with what John Huston and Henry Blanke did with that?
Yeah, and it's funny, we have very few records of him actually seeing the films, but we know that he did see the Maltese Falcon, the Huston version, a number of times. He said, he recommended to my grandmother that she see it. He said, they did a pretty good job of it this time for a change.
I'll agree with that.
Yeah.
I'll agree with that.
Yeah.
Now, what about MGM and the whole Nick and Nora Charles? I mean, if you say Nick and Nora Charles, you think of Bill Powell and Myrna Loy. I mean, and those pictures still hold up, and they're still so charming and pithy and interesting. Did your grandfather not get anything out of those, and it was just the publisher and the studios dividing up the money?
So I believe in that one they were still sold the movie rights, No, I don't think so, because I think at that point they were making movie deals out of it. And even with the Glass Key, I think the movie deal was was separate from that. I'm not sure when they.
Well, the Glass Key, I happened to do the commentary track on that on the Blu-ray that was just released, along with 2 other Ladd pictures, This Gun for Hire and The Blue Dahlia. Sorry for the plug here. But the deal on the Glass Key was it got sold right after your father wrote it, and they made the first version, and apparently Paramount owned it in perpetuity, bought it, so then they came up and said, well, let's do it again with Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake and Don Levy, you know. But apparently they only paid for it once, and that was it.
Same with Warner Brothers and the Maltese Falcon. That's why they were willing to give Houston a chance.
Right,
you know, to direct.
Exactly.
So
and Houston always claimed that he filmed the book, and the other versions didn't film the book.
Well, there's a lot of truth in that.
There is a lot of truth to that.
So
you were saying,
the Thin Man. So he didn't have control. I don't think he had any involvement or control in the first film.
Right, the 34.
The 34, which was amazing. I mean, they bought it within days, like 8 days of the book being published.
Wow.
They purchased the novel, or purchased the film rights, and it was out like later that same year. They had One Shot Woody, right?
Right. Yeah. Woody Van Dyke.
Yeah. So really,
he never did a second take unless the corpse on the floor sneezed, and something like that. I mean, he just move on, and someone was running for the light with the lights to the next setup. And
that scene where Myrna Loy walks in with all the packages and the dog, and she wants her martinis, right? She walks into the bar, and she trips and stumbles. Unbeknownst to her, he asked her if she could do a fall, and she's a terrific dancer and very well coordinated. She says, "Of course I can do that." And so he set the camera, I think, on the floor and said, "Well, just do a trial run." And so he did it with the camera running and said, "Okay, that's good. That's it."
So, he didn't waste time.
Yeah. So my grandfather had no involvement with that one, but he was hired to write the screen stories for the first 2 sequels. After The Thin Man and Another Thin Man. He worked with Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, who were good friends of his, on both of those. And eventually, at that point, we're in the mid-30s. My grandfather's starting to become political. We're still deep in the Depression.
Yeah.
This contrast between Nick and Nora and the high life, and the people in the streets and the breadlines.
People, 1/3 of the country's out of work, and he's living on martinis.
Right. Right. And my grandfather was making at that point $100,000 a year off one thing and another, so it was pretty hard for him to stomach. So he pretty much drank himself almost to death in both cases, and by the time he was finished with the screenplays, in both cases he would go back to New York and basically be hospitalized. Terribly thin, often dealing with venereal diseases and alcoholism. It was pretty bad. So
now, at what point did he get involved with Lillian Hellman and that whole relationship that shaped the latter part of his life? I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, 1931. They met at a party at Daryl Zanuck's house, and
always Zanuck.
Yeah, he is in the middle of everything,
yes,
isn't he?
Is.
So they were both married to other people. But they met that night, and they had a relationship that lasted 30 years, off and on. Neither was ever faithful to the other. They never married. At one point, she became pregnant, and my grandfather got a mail-order Mexican divorce from my grandmother that wasn't legal. And then she decided to get an abortion, and that was the end of that business.
Right.
So my mother said she was kind of like the stepmother, kind of intimidating, a very intimidating stepmother.
I can imagine.
Yeah. So, but they had, I think, an important intellectual relationship, which was hard for him, being as smart as he was.
Right.
My grandmother was a very nice woman and an attractive woman, and very good-natured, but
she was not an intellectual, not high.
She only had an 8th grade education.
Right.
And so he really needed to move in those circles where he was hobnobbing with the literati at the round table in New York.
Now, his politics, was he, I know he was socialist, was he a member of the Communist Party, and how did that work against him, obviously, during the end of the 40s and into the 50s?
Yeah. So we think he joined the Communist Party USA around 1936. Obviously, there's no membership roster. for kind of obvious reasons. And some people say there were membership cards, other people say no, but it's pretty clear that by 1936-37, he's actively involved with the Communist Party. It was easy to do in those days because a lot of the socialist causes were really basic. They're what we would just consider liberal causes today. You know.
Oh yeah. Well, a lot of people joined the Communist Party because there was no social safety net. A third of the country was out of work, and people were looking around for alternatives. Plus the fact that the Soviet Union, there wasn't a lot of news on what was really going on, so it was viewed in some circles, particularly Ms. Hellman, as this kind of socialist utopia, which actually it was like a medieval nightmare.
Yeah.
And the reporting was bad. But be that as it may, your grandfather was a member of the party, and so did that eventually catch up with him in the 50s?
So I would say probably more important than being a member of the party is he was a Marxist. Because he actually read and understood Marx, and he was one of the few who really could do that. And the Marxism precedes the communism, really, and is more of an economic system, right, before it's a political system. So he did do that. So he was, openly fundraising and openly affiliated with the communists. He went into the service in World War II, served in Alaska. While he was up in Alaska, he actually considered running for public office as a communist, because there were people who were running for office. There was a city councilman in New York.
Oh yeah.
There was plenty.
Vito Marcantonio. Yes.
And it was not that unusual. We had political candidates for president.
Yeah.
So he comes out, but then by the time he comes out of the army, the end of World War II, things have changed dramatically. So he gets swept up in the whole HUAC era, the McCarthy era. He is never called before HUAC, but he is called into court. He was, in 1949, he was president of the Civil Rights Congress of New York. So that was an organization that helped, support civil rights, minority rights, liberal causes in general, people unfairly accused of things. About that time, 11 communist leaders were arrested under the Smith Act and called into jail. The Civil Rights Congress of New York provided the bail money for those 11 people. My grandfather was also chair of the bail fund. So he's called into 11th District Federal Court. Because some of the guys had skipped bail, 4 of them had jumped bail. So they want to know first, where are the 4 guys who jumped bail? Well, nobody with any sense would have told my grandfather where they had gone.
Sure.
They were probably in Mexico, but why spread that information? But the really important question, of course, was who were the contributors to the bail fund?
Yeah.
Because they wanted him to name names, and he wouldn't do it, and he wouldn't do it, and he wouldn't do it, and he took the 5th, and took the 5th. And eventually was sentenced to contempt of court, charged with contempt of court, sentenced to 6 months in prison. So they took him to the West Street Jail in New York. His bail at that point was set at $10,000. Now he's had no income in recent years with this, because all his radio shows have gone off the air.
Right.
His books have pretty much gone out of print. His secretary, Muriel Golden, at that point, comes in. She has $10,000 in cash. She walks into the West Street Jail and tries to pay his bail, and they wouldn't take it because she wouldn't tell them
where she got the money.
I mean,
wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
she was furious.
So finally, after he got out, there were the years of poor health, and I believe he passed in, 61?
61.
Did you get a chance to know him at all, or how, I know going back that far is tough, but just to close this off, I mean.
So, he was in ill health and kind of just quietly lived his life after he got out of jail. I only met him once. He was living on Martha's Vineyard Island in the mill house that he and Lillian Hellman owned. And I was not quite 3.5 years old.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Yeah, so my parents would have known that he was dying at that point of lung cancer. We didn't know as kids. I have a few snippets of memories. They had those large standard poodles that, so you can imagine, as a 3-year-old, I was fascinated by the dogs.
Of course.
So I remember, teaching me to feed the dog, and going up to the top of the mill house, the mill room, and making echoey noises. And I remember Lillian Hellman driving the car. But that's it, little snapshots.
Yeah, little
of memory.
snapshots.
So
Yeah.
it's been a strange and kind of wonderful thing for me to get to know him posthumously, and
Right.
I'm reluctant to use the word unique, but I don't know anybody else who has a story exactly like
No,
this.
I think it is unique, and the fact that what's really wonderful is that you were able to come here today and share this with us after the class key. So Julie, thank you so much.